Which of these paragraphs uses quotes appropriately? Well, to answer that question, we have to think about what quotes fundamentally are and what's appropriate use of them. When people are reading a passage and they see this symbol, the basic understanding is that someone other than you, the writer, is talking. Right? Now, these words come from another person. For instance, Dennis Dutton, or maybe Joanna Kornblatt. When we're doing this type of direct quoting in APA, just remember to put a page or paragraph number, like you see here. This isn't the only way we can use quotes, though. We also use them to set terms apart from the rest of a text, like, facial averageness or fecundity. Readers might not know these terms. We only need to do this with quotation marks the first time we introduce the term, and we don't need any sort of reporting phrase here, like according to Kanazawa, right? We also don't need that page or paragraph reference. These are commonly used terms. A third use of quotes is what we'll call a scare quote. It's like we want to kind of distance ourselves from a common idiom or word. We do this when we're talking. We call it air quotes or finger quotes. You've probably seen people do this, like, "Oh, did you have fun at Joe's party?" Like, quote unquote party. Like, here the meaning is like, other people may call that a party. I would never call that a party, right? It's like we want to kind of create that sort of distance, and hence why we call it a scare quote or a shudder quote. Like the idea makes us shudder. This, of course, happens in writing too, and it can be done appropriately and inappropriately. Pinker has some good examples in his style guide. Here's one example that he calls appropriate. They executed their sister to preserve the family's honor. Well, they may have used that word, but either writer would not, all right? That's fine, create the distance, okay? But, here's something an example he shares from a letter of recommendation he once got. She's a quote-unquote quick study and has been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. So here's his comment about it. Okay, is she a quick study or is she a quote-unquote quick study? Like an alleged quick study or rumored to be a quick study when she really isn't. Life is full of these kind of inappropriate uses of scare quotes, like these. We see them a lot in signage, like these show, or in kind of these examples as well. This one's particularly epic, but we also see the occasional clever and appropriate use. Anyone who has small children will appreciate this example from the Knuffle Bunny series. Trixie, quote unquote, ate her dinner and then devoured her dessert. All right. Pinker's advice on scare quotes is as follows. You just try to be confident in your own voice. If you're not comfortable using an expression, maybe just don't use it at all. When you look at R4B writing, you see some, inappropriate and appropriate uses. Here's something that's inappropriate, right? Quote unquote beauty. Well, are you uncomfortable using that word? We don't really need it around evolutionary psychology. This is that's the name of the field. It's established, right? We don't say things like I study quote unquote math, right? This, however, might be appropriate, right? This blonde bombshell, this writer might want to maybe distance herself from this old idiom. There's kind of some stereotyping that goes into it. It's not like maybe there's a negative connotation in the sense almost. Fine, create that distance. That makes sense. But, aside from the occasional term that we need to introduce, like fecundity or averageness or whatever, or that occasional scare quote, like blonde bombshell, when should we use quotes in our writing? Well, that depends on what type of writing you are doing, all right? If we're doing, for instance, summary analysis, like, many college students do, you got to think about the nature of the writing. Here, there's usually one source, right? There's some book or speech or whatever that we're analyzing, and that source is the topic, right? So if I have a speech by Martin Luther King, that speech is the topic. If I'm analyzing Romeo and Juliet's my topic, all right? And we're looking at the source in depth, and as a result, there's going to be a lot of quoting, right? I mean, and the quoting is there to kind of provide some substance. Take a look at these example summary analysis paragraphs, right? We're summarizing a speech, in this case by Sidney Pollack, a filmmaker, and you can see that there's, quotes kind of right there in the middle of the paragraph, kind of, adding some substance. Take a look at another example. Here we see, 3 quotes, and notice that Pollack as topic is, coming up a lot, and also he tends to be at the front of sentences, right? Like, because that's how we help readers keep their eye trained on the topic. Another thing we'll notice when we look at these examples is that the quotes are first introduced, and then there's some sort of analysis that comes after the quote, right? Here's the quote, and here's the analysis that kind of comments on what the quote means, and this pattern is repeated. A lot of us have had instruction on how to do this type of kind of quotation sandwich in other writing classes. But synthesis is a different animal, right? Now we've got many sources, and the source is not the topic, right? Maybe the topic is beauty, but the sources are diverse. We're looking at the topic in depth rather than the sources themselves. And this has some impacts on the writing. One of them is that there's less use of quoting. So here is the paragraph that uses quotes appropriately. One thing you'll note is that aside from that brief Shutter quote, there's only one other quote. All right. Well, but that's not the only important thing that's kind of going on here. It's also how the quotes are used. In particular, the quote is here to provide flavor, not substance, right? The writer is the one who's really providing the substance. This writer is paraphrasing, summarizing, but she doesn't need to be the only voice. So why not bring in a little bit of, just another voice for a little bit of variety, just for a little bit of flavor, just to break things up. But the other key thing here is that the analysis comes first and then is echoed by the quote. So in this sense, the quote is there to just kind of provide some support, right? This writer has been, making all these connections between, various physical features and then how they relate to things like fertility, right? And the writer has pretty much already established this idea herself. She said this herself already. The quote is just here to kind of echo and just kind of sum it up in a nice way. And that's what is inappropriate about these paragraphs. I've highlighted, color coded it so you can see what's going on. First of all, look how they're dominated by quoting. So it's kind of like the writer's voice never comes through in these pieces. And then also notice how, in order to deal with all these quotes, and there's all this reporting language here. Well, they explain and then they say, and notice that this takes the reader's focus off the topic. This paragraph is not about evolutionary psychologists. This paragraph is about women's mating standards. Okay, but notice how that's getting pushed to the middle of sentences, and the spotlight instead is on evolutionary psychologists, right? And you get the same thing here. This paragraph is about facial attractiveness, but it's only mentioned once, right? Instead, we get a lot of talk about he said, she said, all right? So, I think some ways that we can kind of remember this, some analogies here, is one way is to think of a quoting and synthesis like salt and pepper. It adds flavor, not substance. All right. If you never put any salt and pepper, it can be a little bland. But if you add too much, you ruin the dish. So the key here is to kind of sprinkle it in here and there at the right place. And when you're thinking about what the right place is, the analogy I think that helps is like a backup singer in music. They echo the key lines, right? They add a little emphasis to the key points, but you don't constantly hand the microphone back and forth because that would feel incoherent, all right? Okay, let's see if you can find a piece of your writing that demonstrates appropriate use of quotes in synthesis.